technology failures. So there we go. All right, so cardiology is like a quite a large chunk of both the textbook and what you kind of need to know. Um, it's sort of like learning a new language because you have to kind of be able to decipher what all the squiggles mean. Um, but at the same time, it kind of once you get the basics, you kind of have a better idea what's going on. And at the same time, when you have the basics down, you can look at something and go, "Oh, that's not right." So heart disease, right? We are going to see this a lot because it is the leading cause of death for men and women in the United States. That cause of death for men is a bit higher than for women until women hit menopause, and then the ratio sort of balances out because women lose that protective estrogen. Um, and that in the United States, about 90% of people, yes, I'll get the review sheet for you. Um, and about 90% of the people who have out of hospital cardiac arrests do in fact die, right? We don't have great ROSCs with good neuro outcomes out of hospital because there's a lot of things kind of impacting that. For example, people not recognizing that a patient is in cardiac arrest. I've had a number of occasions where, like, for example, I had a police officer tell me, no, he's breathing, he's fine. And the patient was doing that, like, froggy breathing, like them. And I was like, no, he's just do CPR. Didn't even have to do a pulse check. Looked at him and said, he's in cardiac arrest. Had another gentleman who collapsed on the sidewalk in Jamaica. He was down for God knows how long because everyone thought he was just a drunk, right? So you have to kind of look at your environment. No, this is not from Nancy. You have to look at the environment that you're in and understand kind of what's going on, right? You should have a high index of suspicion when a patient just doesn't look right. A number of risk factors that people have when it comes to cardiac issues. Significant or advanced age, ethnicity, right? So in the Jamaica area, Guyanese patients have a really high incidence of cardiac issues. Men in general, high issues, mostly because those are the people who we did all our research on, so we find them more often. Women also have that protective estrogen up until menopause. And family history. Family history is significant. You can have patients who are very young, who are having chest pain and like, well, oh, it's probably nothing. It's probably just an anxiety attack. But it's actually a cardiac in nature because maybe they had a family member who died in their 30s. It kind of runs in families. Other issues: smoking, sedentary lifestyles, right? If you don't exercise regularly, high cholesterol, inflammation is really the bigger problem with high cholesterol. There's plenty of people who have high cholesterol their entire lives and never develop cardiac disease. But they have very, very low inflammation. The second you have high cholesterol and high inflammation is when that cholesterol starts to stick, right? It starts to stick to the inside. And we don't necessarily know if we have high inflammation or not. High blood pressure, smoking is obviously, we all kind of well aware of that constricts your vasculature and makes it easier for all that cholesterol to stick. Excuse me. A brief review of anatomy. In case you forgot what the heart looks like, it kind of looks like this, okay? Right, you have two atrias on top, which are your lower pressure, right? Because they are less muscular. They're receiving blood back from parts of the body, lungs or body in general, respectively. You have two ventricles, which are more muscular. The left ventricle is the workhorse of the heart. It is the one that pumps the blood round and round to everything. The right ventricle is less muscular because all it has to do is get to the lungs, right? It doesn't have to go very far. The right side of the heart is traditionally your deoxygenated blood, while your left is your oxygenated blood. Fetal circulation obviously is different. If anyone has and patent forum ovale, that could cause mixing of the blood, but usually that's detected pretty early, usually. Then you have your valves, okay? You have valves inside the heart, which is your atrial ventricle valves, your AV valves, right? Which is your tricuspid and your mitral, okay? And then you have the semilunar valves, which are not technically inside the heart. They're technically in the vasculature outside. Okay, so technically the semilunar valves are in the pulmonary artery and the aorta, and they're named as such. Okay, so if you ever have that moment where you're like, oh no, I can't remember which is which, pulmonary and aortic valves are in the pulmonary artery and the aorta. Okay, what they're named after. In terms of the AV valves, it's our RAT is RAT, right atria tricuspid. That's one of those things that people apparently remember. If you remember it, you do. If you don't, whatever. You could also LM, right? LMNOP, left side mitral valve. Different ways to remember it, just kind of keep that in mind because knowing the blood flow through the heart is essential. You are likely to be quizzed on this. You are likely going to have all sorts of questions regarding this because it just is one of those things you need to have cold, okay? You should be able to follow a blood drop through the heart and the body. It's a BLS skill, right? You should know how the body and the human heart works. So if you have any questions about those things, you should review it. There's 3 layers of the heart. And I think we're probably more familiar with the layers of the heart due to issues that, like infections that you might see, right? So you have the pericardium, which is the outside, right? So it's like that sac that surrounds the heart. The pericardium holds a small amount of fluid between the between the outside, right, and the myocardium. So hold on, let me see if I can do a little annotation. And that's what we traditionally call the pericarditis, right? You have inflammation in that area. A pericardial effusion or a pericardial tamponade is right here, right? So you have your pericardium right here, and then you have all the fluid. There's about 10 cc's of fluid that lives between the pericardium and the myocardium. The myocardium is the muscle. Myo means muscle. Rhabdomyolysis or myelitis, right, is a muscle breakdown. Myocardium is the muscle. This is the part that does the work. Okay. Myocarditis, right, of inflammation of the heart muscle, very painful. It's one of those things that was a possible side effect of the vaccines. And then you have your endocardium, right, which is like this thin layer on the inside of the heart, because every part of your body, muscles, etc., have this like layer that it's surrounded by, right? Because it reduces friction, reduces like heat generation, and makes everything run smoother. Endocarditis, right, inflammation of endocardium is usually what affects the valves, right? The valves are kind of funky looking, right? If you kind of see here, they're not like that kind of traditional, they're kind of fibrous. They're not like these weird mechanical looking things that we kind of imagine. Um, Endocarditis is very commonly associated with IV drug users because you're injecting potential bacteria right into the vein, and it goes and it lives on the heart valves. And it floats into here and it hangs out and it becomes what's called vegetative. Okay, so that's the most common cause of heart valve replacement in young individuals is endocarditis. It's vegetative endocarditis because that bacteria from the IV drug use goes and it hangs out on that valve and it destroys it. Okay, so those are some things to keep in mind. So when you have if you have any inflammation in the pericardial area, right, or you have a collection of fluid, thank you. Stopping my annotation. If you have any fluid in that area, it's going to prevent the heart from expanding during diastole and refilling. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Okay, This is where we start to get a little more ALS-y. There are three major arteries that supply the human heart with blood. Most importantly, you need to know, let me get this notation back. Right over here, right off the aorta, is where the heart is supplied blood. The aortic valve, oh God. The annotator on this thing is the absolute worst. We're gonna just work with it. The aortic valve lives, our mother, lives right here. So during systole, when the blood is flowing through, this valve covers if I just get up and walk away, it's because me and the annotator are fighting. It covers right during systole as the blood's flowing right through the heart. This covers the opening for the coronary arteries. So there's no blood going into the coronary arteries during systole. As your heart beats, it's a pulsation, right? You're not having like a constant flow of blood. So during diastole, when the valve is closed, the blood flow kind of comes back, right? That's why the valve is closed, because it doesn't want to take this blood back into the heart and keep pumping the same exact blood over and over. But as it backflows during diastole, it starts to fill the coronary arteries. Okay, so that bottom number indicates about the pressure that the coronary arteries are experiencing when they're being filled. So if your blood pressure is 200 over 100, that's 100 millimeters of mercury pressure going into the coronary arteries. Okay, if it's 70 over 30, it's 30. That's the pressure. So the coronary arteries are being filled with slightly less pressure than you would anticipate, in the body as a whole. Good. So now you have where this breaks off right here. This is your left coronary artery. The left coronary artery splits into two significant ones, other arteries. It splits into the circumflex, which kind of comes around the back of the heart and gets the lateral wall. We're going to cover this again later, so don't worry too much. Oh, for the love. The lateral wall. Pretend that says lateral. And then you have your left anterior descending, which gives your septum. And your anterior wall, right? Anterior descending covers the anterior wall. These two give you the majority of your left ventricle. So if you have a high blockage in your left coronary artery, like up here, for example, you're taking out the entire left ventricle, and that's what's called the widowmaker. Okay? Now, the blood flow also goes over here onto the right side, which apparently I'm not allowed to doodle on. Your right coronary artery also comes over here, comes from here. Oh, for the love of Pete. Comes through. And it fills and comes over here. So where your SA node, nope, for the love of God. The SA node lives right here, right about, I don't know if you guys can see. Going back to Zoom, where that sucks. Your SA node lives about there. So your right coronary artery is protecting is providing blood flow to your SA node, as well as part of your AV node, which is about right there. AV node can also be getting blood from the left coronary artery and the LAD. Your right coronary artery provides blood to the electrical system, as well as the right atria and the right ventricle, right? Put a little, that's like your right ventricle. It's like right there. Right there. Okay, so this is all your right ventricle. So if you have on your EKG, this is going to show as being an inferior wall. Okay, and again, we'll talk about this more when I give you the 12 lead, but I just want you to visualize where the blood flow is going and start putting the pieces together. Oh, here we go, is another picture of the heart, for those of you who like color and would like to see this way. We don't really talk about the right marginal artery. That's when you're going in and being like way more specific, because we don't do angiograms, right? So we can kind of identify what parts of the heart are being affected by the 12 lead. We're not going to get super specific, like the left marginal, the right marginal. Just the three that you're really responsible for understanding are the main ones, which is your left circumflex, your left anterior descending, and your right coronary. So, a little vocab that you might see is anastomoses. Anastomoses are also collateral blood vessels. This is the reason that older people survive heart attacks better than younger people. So basically what happens is as you get older and any potential blockages start to develop, the body goes, well, this isn't right. Like, I need blood here still. So it actually will create new blood vessels to naturally bypass a blockage. So if that area does happen to get blocked off, like you can see in the right side picture here, it's okay because it will supply blood in an alternative fashion. Again, so this is why older people survive better, is because they have multiple routes to provide different parts of the heart with blood. So if one spot gets blocked off, you're not taking out the entire ventricle, you're taking out maybe a very small area because the body has compensated. Collateral circulation is significant in surviving a cardiac event. Questions, thoughts, concerns? Okie dokie. More BLS, all right? Just a review. On the right side, you have low pressure. It goes to the lungs and nowhere else. If you have really high right-sided heart pressures, you're going to cause damage to the lungs, right? This is just, it's problematic. So from the top, coming back into the right atria is blood from systemic circulation, right? This is all the blood that has come from your legs and your arms and your stomach and whatever, right? And it's carrying waste products. Goes through the inferior and superior vena cava and come back to meet at the right atria. At the right atria, it goes through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. At the right ventricle, it comes up through the pulmonary valve into the pulmonary arteries and goes to the right and left lungs. It goes swooshing around the lungs, gets all that waste product gone, picks up all of the new shiny new oxygen, right? And then comes back through the pulmonary veins to the left atria. At the left atria, it goes through the mitral valve to the left ventricle. The left ventricle does its power up. It goes up through the aortic valve to the aorta, which is approximately the size of a garden hose, and then goes back and to systemic circulation. Okay, and round it goes. Okay, any questions? Sweet. Your atria, so this is one of the problems that we have with patients who are not we, but patients who have a fib have concerns when it comes to how good their output is, because the atria's work is primer pumps, okay? The quote unquote atrial kick. Your blood can flow passively through the atrias with not a lot of issue, right? They can go into the ventricles and they'll keep going to the rest of the body. However, when the atria pump, it provides another like 20 to 30% of blood into the ventricles. Does everyone kind of remember the Frank Starling effect from BLS? I even have a rubber band to show, right? Frank Starling effect, right? The further you stretch a rubber band, the further it goes if you let go. So if you think of the ventricle, I need like a dark background. If you think of the ventricle as a rubber band, if you don't stretch it that much, it's not going to go very far when it goes to systole, right? It's just going to kind of go like whatever. That extra 20% of blood really stretches that ventricle out, so it makes it further when it contracts. All right, so you're getting more blood to the body because of the atria's participation. As I said, the atrias don't necessarily have to pump for the ventricles to fill, but it provides that extra boost. So your heart is working more effectively and efficiently when the atrias are participating. In AFib, they're just kind of doing this. They're not pumping. They might pump every once in a while, but they're not doing it in conjunction. They're not doing it in a meaningful way. So it's just that kind of passive blood flow through the heart valve that's then supporting the rest of the body. The heart has to work harder to get it that much blood. In order for your heart to be effective, the pressure in the ventricles has to be better or stronger than the pressure in the pulmonary and aortic arteries for the blood to go around. That pressure in the pulmonary and aortic arteries is called your afterload. Okay? It's after the heart. The amount of pressure it's going to require to push that load forward. Preload is what's coming back from the body and stretching the ventricles. Okay? Before the heart. So if your systemic pressure in your veins does not outweigh the systemic pressure in your arteries or the power of your heart to overcome it, your blood's not going anywhere, right? This is why we need to have a coordinated lub-dub for the heart to work effectively. That's why the Frank Starling effect is so important, because you have to overcome the pressure of all of the arteries and all of the body in order to move blood forward. Does that make sense? Take your silence as acquiescence. So, your stroke volume is how much blood is ejected from the heart every time of the ventricles contract. Okay? And that kind of that stroke volume is highly dependent on preload, which is the volume of blood returning to the heart. So if you have a patient who's in a shock state, right? They are hypovolemic, they're secondary to dehydration or hemorrhage, right? That stroke volume is going to be reduced because the preload is reduced. There's no blood to push around. If your afterload resistance increases significantly, usually what you see in cases of like APE, the heart has to pump harder. And if the heart is weakened in any way, shape, or form, it won't go against it, right? That's your cardiogenic shocks, right? The heart's weak, it can't pump against the resistance, your blood pressure tanks because it's just not going anywhere. And then you have your myocardial contractility, is how well, this is your cardiogenic shock, is how well does the heart muscle contract, right? So your afterload would be your APEs, your contractility is your cardiogenic shock, preload, anything that's reducing the amount of volume coming back to the heart. Again, Frank Starling law, we talked about this. The heart will contract stronger when it's stretched more, but that has its own limits, right? If you stretch and stretch and stretch a rubber band, it can snap. Same thing with the heart. If you stretch and stretch and stretch the heart, it's not going to be effective. It turns into kind of like this soggy paper bag, and just there's no resistance after a while because you've overstretched the muscle. It doesn't happen right away. It happens over a period of time, and this is why hypertension is so dangerous, because you're constantly putting too much pressure on those fibers, right? So you're constantly putting all that pressure on the fibers, so you're not getting anything back in return because the muscle's overstretched. This is important. You should remember this. Your cardiac output is equal to the stroke volume times your heart rate. So, if your stroke volume is 500 milliliters and you have a heart rate of 60, it's 500 times 60 is 3,000 milliliters a minute. I give up with this thing. So if you change one or the other, your heart rate, your body wants to have a very consistent cardiac output. So if you increase your stroke volume, the heart rate will go down. If you increase the heart rate, the stroke volume should go down, right? Because it doesn't need to work as hard. Your heart wants to do as little effort as possible. So if your stroke volume goes down to 250, like you're bleeding out, your heart rate's going to have to double, right? And this is what can't with this thing. So if stroke volume is 250, your heart rate's going to have to double, right? If I reduce this by half, it's probably going to be around 120. Because that keeps you at 3,000 milliliters a minute. That makes sense. Either you've all fallen asleep or you understand. We'd like to stop annotating now. Such a jerk. So your heart is primarily under the control of the parasympathetic nervous system. And that doesn't sound like that makes sense, but think of it this way. If your fight or flight response was always on for your heart rate would constantly be out of control and you would get tired. Could you imagine the number of calories you would need to eat every day if your heart rate just hung out in like 200? You'd be a hummingbird, right? The parasympathetic nervous system keeps the heart rate down, right? It keeps everything very like chill. It keeps the contractility under control so you're not like overdoing the heart rate or the volume. It doesn't really impact the stroke volume, but we just talked about, right? Stroke volume times heart rate. So parasympathetic doesn't affect your stroke volume, it just controls your heart rate. Your sympathetic nervous system can impact your heart rate when it overrides the parasympathetic nervous system, right? This is when you have that fight or flight response. The thing that the sympathetic nervous system primarily does is it actually influences your stroke volume based on dilation or constriction of the coronary arteries, as well as the rest of the arteries in your body. Okay? Hormones that will impact your heart as well, right? Or your cardiac output. You have your epinephrine and norepinephrine. These are your sympathetic nervous system hormones, right? Your fight or flight. They do all the things you anticipate that they're going to do. It over here on the left, it constricts blood vessels from things that it deems as not important, right? So your skin, your stomach, well, it dilates blood vessels in the important spots like your skeletal muscles in your heart, right? Because you're running away from a lion. And then you have your norepinephrine, which constricts blood vessels and stimulates your cardiac muscles in order to increase your heart rate. The human heart has a very unique, the muscles have a very unique ability to produce their own electric, which is called automaticity. That automaticity is caused by different gradients of the electrolytes that like exist, right? So we kind of remember, right, that potassium is the number one electrolyte inside of a cell, whereas sodium is the number one electrolyte outside of the cell. Now you have other players in the field in the cardiac system in particular, and that's magnesium and calcium. Calcium gives the muscle its ability to contract, the strength of contraction. So if you are very low on calcium, it won't contract as hard. This is the patients who are on calcium channel blockers, right? If they block the channel for the calcium to get into the myocardial cells, they won't be able to contract as well, which is what kind of by and by reduces the blood pressure. Okay. Here's a fun picture. So we're going to talk a bunch about depolarization and repolarization. So your heart kind of chills based on the gradient at -70 to -90 millivolts. In order to get the heart to contract, it depolarizes, which drops, which changes the millivolts. It increases the, it changes what the electricity is inside the heart. Okay, so as sodium starts to rush in, it pushes potassium out and it changes the gradient. This is an active process that requires energy on the sodium-potassium exchange pump, right? Because it's moving against the natural gradient. It's moving things in places where they shouldn't necessarily be, because the body's happy. You've got, sodium out here and you've got potassium in here and we're equal. We don't necessarily want to change that so that the electricity is not equal. Everybody likes homeostasis. So this is your action potential chart. You're going to have to remember this. There are always a bunch of questions on this chart, okay, including knowing what your phases are. So here. You start here, right? This is your action potential.
Sorry, do you mean a lot of questions on like our cardiology test or like the National Registry test?
Yes, both.
Gotcha.
So you're starting here at your action potential. Hold on, let me see if I have the. All right, I'll do it again in a little bit, right? So you're here at the action potential. On the EKG, this is your isoelectric line. There's nothing going on. Isoelectric meaning nothing moving, okay? We're just chilling. So you're hanging out here, action potential. You have the potential of automaticity. When phase 0 occurs, you're increasing the electric above 0, right? So you have a very a positive influx, right? Your potassium comes rushing inside the heart, or sorry, that's sodium. Sodium comes rushing into the heart. Potassium's still there, it's still hanging out, right? So now you're increasing the positive ions that are inside the heart, and I'm having a hard time speaking today, I apologize. And it's rushing in and it's changing the gradient, right? So now you're here at phase 1. At phase 1, calcium slowly starts to seep in, okay? And that continues to change the positive, because as the positive moves, more positive ions move in, the potassium gets pushed out, okay? It's important that the calcium goes in, though, because this is going to increase the strength of the contraction of the heart. Potassium doesn't do that. Sodium doesn't do that. That's the calcium that's important. So here you've had what's called depolarization, right? It is polarizing, right? Everyone kind of knows like the polar ends, right? You have a positive end of the earth and the negative end of the earth. You're at polar opposite sides. That's what's going on. You're changing from a negative. You're going from the South Pole to the North Pole. There you go. That makes sense? So you've polarized or depolarized the heart into the opposite side over here. That's when the calcium starts rushing in. Okay. As the calcium starts rushing in, that causes the contraction. So you have the electric moving in, or the electric changing, and then the contraction changing. So as you're here, and you have your calcium and your potassium doing all the switcheroos, this is the effective refractory period. Okay, the refractory period being you're going to need a significant amount of electric or stimulation to make it depolarize again. Because when the heart depolarizes, it's depolarization, contraction, 1, 2. It kind of happened right quickly in a row. You don't want the heart to try to depolarize and contract again when it has no blood in it, right? That's when you get your V-fibs and your V-tachs. That's not helpful. You can't survive on that. So you enter this effective refractory period, which means that you aren't really stimulating the heart that much. During phase 3, going back to that isoelectric line, you have what's called repolarization. I'm just going to put repol. Repolarization is when everybody kind of goes back to where they started. Okay, it's like that reset. So the potassium is being actively pumped back into the heart. See right here, potassium is being pumped back in. The sodium's being pumped back out. You are expending energy, that ATP, in order to make that happen. At the same time, as more sodium comes in, it pushes the calcium back out. Okay? And you are back to square one. And you're back at that isoelectric line at that rest stage where no electric activity is going on. I have a picture to kind of put the EKG over it, which might make it make more sense, but we're just going to talk about that. Um, Here you go, for anyone who likes a different type of picture. At phase 0, your sodium goes in. Phase 1, potassium and chloride goes out. Phase 2, calcium comes in and more potassium is pushed out. Phase 3, potassium starts going out and then comes back in. And phase 4 is just isoelectric. Sometimes it's going to be the hardest part is remembering what the numbers of each of the phases. So we talked about this, but we'll just review real quick. Phase 0 is rapid depolarization, right? That very quick change in the amperage, the millivolt inside the heart. You have fast and slow sodium channels. Your fast sodium channels open up, so the sodium comes rushing into the cell. The cell becomes extremely positively charged, and it starts to lead to muscular contraction. Phase 1 is early repolarization, right? Then you have your calcium coming in and supporting, or in phase 2, it starts to come in to support. Potassium starts to leak, starts to come down to resting permeability state. Calcium slowly enters and keeps the cells in that prolonged depolarization so that muscular contraction can complete. You're not having like a little weak contraction. Potassium will slowly leak out. And phase 3 is kind of where everybody hits back to where they're supposed to be. Your calcium channels close. Your potassium is back inside, and sodium is back outside. Okay, your heart likes to be at that stage. This is why it activates that negative 96, because it keeps everybody happy, the heart happy. It's where it likes to be.
Quick question.
Go ahead.
In that last slide, it's showing that potassium is always coming out. When does it ever get back in?
It comes back in around at the end of phase 3. During this repolarization phase, this down sweep. Like right around where phase 4 starts, it starts to be pumped back in. That like flat line is everyone's been reset.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So if you see up here, it's not exactly the best picture of an EKG either, but it's just looking at the ventricles. There's no atrial in here, right? So we're kind of familiar with like the QRS, right? Because that's that big significant up and down. That's the traveling of electric in the muscle, okay? And you have to remember, like the muscle comes down and around, right? That's the shape of the heart. So when you hit depolarization, up here at the top, depolarization is when you seeing your QRS, right? Because there's a change in the electric inside the heart. Your isoelectric line is that space in between heartbeats, okay? And then this is your space in between heartbeats. And this is your T wave, right? This is when it's starting to repolarize. So you have your depolarization, which is represented by your QRS, and then your repolarization, which is represented by your T wave. Then we talked about the refractory period. Your refractory period goes from the end of your QRS to absolutely you cannot stimulate the muscle to the top of the T wave. And then you have what's called a relative refractory period, which is the top of the T wave to the end of the T wave. The relative refractory period it's hard to stimulate the heart muscle, but you can if you try hard enough. Okay? Any other questions? All right. So, again, this is mostly BLS, but now we're just adding another layer on top of it. Your heart has inherent discharge rates, right? Your main pacemaker is your SA node, and that beat usually will produce a heart rate between 60 and 100. Women have a little bit higher of a resting heart rate than men do. If the SA node fails, it goes down to the next level, right? So the next level is if the intra-aortic pathways don't pick up the beat, the AV node does. The AV node has an inherent rate of 40 to 60. If that fails also, something in the ventricles will pick up the beat, and that's between 20 and 40. So you need to know those different categories, and then we're going to teach you how to determine what's acting as the main pacemaker. So, this is just a fun little helpful, oh no, picture, right? So we start here, isoelectric line, nothing's going on, there's no electric. Your heart says, hey, Fran, it's time to beat. The SA node will be stimulated, will depolarize. Now, depolarization, when it goes down the normal pathways, is sort of like the wave, right? One thing goes, everything else follows. Okay? So the atria goes, or the SA node goes, and it depolarizes the atrias. The atrias create what's called the P wave. Okay? It's a teeny tiny little bump, okay? Because it's teeny tiny little bit of muscle mass. All of the atrias will depolarize, and then that will end up here at the AV node. The AV node will cause a brief period of pause for the electrical system because it wants to give the atria a chance to contract and give the ventricles their blood. Once the AV node then fires, then continues the electric, it depolarizes the ventricles. So the ventricles depolarize. You can see the arrow goes down the septum and then up each side the left and right side of the ventricles, right? It kind of cups it like this. You have those Purkinje fibers that come down and around and support the heart underneath, okay? And that's why the QRS looks like an up and down squiggle, right? It's going up and then down, this up the septum, down the ventricles. If that makes sense. Then there's a brief pause. Again, now the ventricles are given an opportunity to contract, and as they contract, you start to see the repolarization here in the T wave, okay? And that's when the electric system starts to reset. The electrics resets in the opposite direction. That's why the T wave, so right, you have a P wave is a positive inflection, QRS is positive. Your T wave, even though it's a negative movement of electric, or the electric is becoming more negative, it's still a positive deflection on your EKG because it's a negative moving towards a negative because it's going in the opposite direction. Okay, that'll make more sense in a little bit, I think. But remember in like 8th grade math, negative times negative is a positive. Same thing. Questions? Okie dokie. Other things that we should know before we get into other stuff. You can have what are called ectopic impulses, right? It's a cell that comes out of the beat, right? So the heart's like just laying down a rhythm, and then like you have that one guy with going on the side. Depending on where it's coming from is what we call it. So if one of the atrial cells decides to contract, it's called a PAC, or a premature atrial contraction. If at the junction, which is in the AV node, if that AV node fires before it's supposed to, it's called a PJC. If it's a ventricular cell that goes, hey, it's a PVC. A lot of the times in young, healthy individuals, these mean absolutely nothing. It's either just like one cell, it's kind of feeling a little irritated, right? And just kind of like just kind of freaks out a little bit. No big deal. Older patients, they start to become more significant. The number one treatment for any ectopic focus is oxygen. That's why heart cells get irritated. Oxygen or caffeine, too much caffeine. That you see that in the younger patients. So here's just some descriptions. Your PVCs you will know because they are funky looking. They are bizarre in shape. PACs and PJCs are sometimes harder to identify because they look very similar to everybody else because they're taking the normal pathway. Okay, they're taking the normal electrical pathway. So we'll talk about them a little bit more. You will see these on tests, so you need to like very carefully look. So if you look at this PAC, you can see that the P wave before it is a little bit different shaped than the one from the beat before. And if you see on the PJC, there's no P wave at all. Okay, that's usually your defining moments. We talked about this already a little bit, right? So if you have too much automaticity, right? Usually it's a sodium issue, too much sodium, atropine, and the other electrolyte issues. Most of the time, it's going to be hypoxia. Or the easiest one for us to treat is hypoxia. It might also be that there's a patient who is having an MI, and that area near the injury is starting to become very irritated. That's a good time to do a 12 lead, right? Maybe they're going to end up getting some aspirin. The electric kind of follows a normal pathway. Re-entry is usually when you see patients like AFib. AFib is usually caused by re-entry. So as it goes down the normal pathway, it blocks it from, it blocks it has like a how would I say this? It has like a self-limiting cycle in there, so it doesn't overstimulate it. But if there's some sort of damage, like you see here in the side picture, if there's some sort of damage that's preventing it from going down, you'll have it continue making a cycle. And that's when you get the AFib, okay? So it's just going around and around and around and regenerating because it doesn't stop. It doesn't hit another electrical impulse and stop. This is why hyperkalemia or high potassium is an issue, because it can also cause problems like this. Just another picture of how reentry works. Goes the non-normal pathway. Questions? All right. Take a 5-minute break, come back at 10:15, and we'll start doing more EKG stuff. All right. We all back? Here.
What's up?
Okay. Sure.
Hey.
Didn't lose anybody. All right. So, basic concepts for the EKG. So I think we might have beaten this to death a little bit, but during depolarization, the heart creates that positive electrical current, right? So we see it. We see it come up, and then we see it, it's essentially moving upwards. When a positive electric current moves towards a positive electrode, it creates that positive deflection. As positive electric moves towards a negative electrode, it creates a negative deflection. Okay? Negative moving towards negative creates a positive. We're going to talk about this a little bit more because now we're going to identify which leads are positive or negative. So, this is what's called Einthoven's triangle. The leg is always positive. Okay? And then this is how we go and define each lead. So lead 1 comes straight across. Okay? Now, heart in there. You have a heart here. Your electric is moving down, back up, right? So you'll see in lead 1, you have your positive electrode is here. It's moving collectively, it's moving towards that positive electrode. So you have a positive deflection, but it also moves back towards the negative electrode a little bit. So you have a little bit of a negative tail right there. Okay? Same thing here. Here's your heart. Electric moves down and then back up, but it's primarily moving towards your positive, so you have a very significant positive deflection, right? Positive electric moving towards a positive lead. This is your lead 2. Lead 2 is what we primarily look at because it's looking along the side of the heart where you're getting a lot of the ventricle. You're seeing more of the atria up here. And then you have lead 3. Again, it's going for, hold on, this is your left arm. Okay. Heart's here. Moving down and then back up. Again, you're going to have, it's almost the majority of that electricity is moving towards that positive electrode, so you get a positive deflection. Does that make sense? Okie. We also have combination leads, which are which are also called your augmented leads. This is your AVL. AVL, AVR, and AVF. Okay. AVF combines two negative arm leads into here. So it's looking at the heart directly up from the feet. Okay, so like if you were sitting underneath somebody, this is what you're seeing. So the electricity is moving down and then up, you have a positive deflection. This is your left arm. Now you're just rotating, right? Because this is like an algorithm that your monitor can do. So your positive electrode's here, your heart's here, going towards and then away, right? But you're looking at it from your right hip. So if you're looking at it this way, the electricity is kind of crossing that, right? So you have both positive and negative deflection. It's going towards the or across the positive and then back away from the positive. Now you're looking in AVR, you're looking from the left hip up. Okay, so the heart's here and you're looking at this way. The AVR actually looks mostly at the aorta. It's kind of coming up across this way, right? Your aorta comes down and around, so you're primarily looking at the aorta. We do not really use AVR in our 12 leads. And see, I'll show you that in a little bit. Annotator is the worst. All right. So we have what's called the hexaxial reference system. This gives you like an idea of what your heart's axis is. So your heart kind of sits right, it sits in your chest like this. Okay. So a normal axis is usually, it's actually a little bit more. It's about, it's from 90 to negative 130. Okay. Right. That you can't even see. This right here, extend this is to negative 30. Negative 30 to a 90 is a normal axis, right? This is where if you have your heart, here's the squiggly version, right? So here's your right ventricle, your left ventricle, okay? The majority of your electric is in your left ventricle, right? It's a larger muscle. So the axis will come down this way. In order to do this, and I actually just learned this is really freaking helpful. They do what they call like the Caesar. So you're looking at lead 1 and lead AVF on your EKG. If the QRS is positive in lead 1 and positive in AVF, you're good. If your lead 1 is positive and your lead AVF is negative, this is my, hold on, I did that wrong. Wrong for you guys. The left side, pretend this is my left hand because I'm flip-flopped. It's a left axis deviation or potential left axis deviation. You have to look at lead 2 to determine if it is or not. If lead 2 is positive, you're good. If lead 2 is negative, it's pathological. If lead 1 is negative and lead AVF is positive, it's a right axis deviation. If they're both negative, it's an extreme axis and the patient's probably in like VTAC or VFib or something. It's not good. Okay. Your lead 1 is on the left-hand side, the lefter side of when you're looking at your 12 lead, and lead AVF is on your right. Having issues with my thumbs up and thumbs down. Mostly because it's getting mirrored through the video. Okay. Your axes kind of give you some ideas about whether or not you're looking at VTAC or like AFib with aberrancy, which we'll talk about more in a little bit. It doesn't come up that much, and if you remember, like your normal axis is negative 30 to positive 90, you should be okay because your 12 lead will give you what the axis is, but I do believe we talk about this a little bit more in the future. It's just something to kind of keep in mind as we talking. You also have your precordial leads, okay, right? These are the ones that sit on your chest. This is your, V1 through V6 and look directly at the heart. So as opposed to having cameras in odd places underneath feet, you're looking directly at the heart itself. So you have V1 and V2, which look directly at the septum. You have V3 and V4, which look at the anterior wall. And then you have V5 and V6, which look at the lateral wall. This is your proper placements, okay? They will 110% quiz you about where the proper placements are, i.e. your intercostal spaces and with the different like landmarks like your sternal border or your midclavicular line. Those questions will come up on your test. When you are actually applying this in the real world, very rarely are you going to be like palpating for ribs. You kind of put V1 and V2 just above the nipple line, and that's usually pretty good. Obviously, if you have an older woman with gravity affected breasts, that nipple line is going to be a little different, but you should be able to kind of figure out what the appropriate placement is. This chest is also apparently super narrow because you'll have plenty of space to place all your leads. You should not overlap your electrodes because that's going to give you reading issues. That's about it, all that one. All right, we're going to talk about this more in 12 leads, but this is your landmarks. I like this one better, honestly. So, right, we talked about the anatomy of the heart. If you are shitty annotator. All right, AVR, we said this already, right? AVR is over here looking at the aorta. We don't really look at this. This is a little bit more advanced 12 lead reading. We're not there yet, and that's okay. Your talked about this before, right? Your left anterior descending, hold on, covers your septum and your anterior walls. So this is septum, septum, anterior, anterior, right? If you guys remember or have ever heard of Sally, this is what Sally is. And then we have your left circumflex, right? So here's your left circumflex coming around this way. Your left anterior is right here. Right, so here's your septum, or sorry, here's your septum, and here's your anterior walls right here. Your left circumflex coming around the back gives you your lateral, and what's also, so here's your lateral leads, right, V5 and V6. And it also, your lateral extends up here into lead 1 and AVL. This is what's called your high lateral. Oh. It's your high lateral wall, okay? It's the wall that's up much closer to the very top of the heart, okay? You can have involvement of an MI in just one in AVL. Now, when we talk about 12 leads in the future, we talk about, I forgot the freaking word, I'm having a moment. Elevations need to be, in order for it to be an MI, they need to be in concurrent leads. So your concurrent leads are anything that brushes up against each other anatomically. So if you have elevations in V6, 1, and AVL, those are considered like anatomically concurrent. You can have V1, V2, you can have V2, V3, you can have V3, V4, V4, V5, V6, like they can be overlapping, okay? Then we also talked about the right coronary artery comes off the aorta, and that supplies your inferior wall. Okay, so have septum, septum, anterior, anterior, lateral, lateral, inferior, inferior, inferior. Okay, those are your Sally, your quote unquote Sally leads. So don't worry about that too much right now because it's coming up in the future, but it will come back. It'll come back around. So primarily, we use lead 2 or V1 because it gives you the best views of your P waves. Okay, because you're evaluating, it gives you a good view of the atrius. You need to kind of know if your patient is experiencing P waves or not, because it might determine how you treat them. Okay, if you have kind of a fuzzy looking isoelectric line and you're like, I don't know if this is an EKG or if this is a P wave or just movement, this is why we choose these leads in particular. It gives you a good view of the atrius. Talking about artifacts, interference. So you could have crappy cables. Body hair is a very commonly concerned one. I can't tell you the number of times where you have a very hairy individual and they stand there holding the leads directly to the chest. Back in the day when PAPD had their own ambulances, they had these wild fluorescent lights in their ambulance, the back of their ambulances, and we'd actually get this middle interference a lot because it just causes it's caused by those lights will interfere with the EKG, which is kind of crazy. This up and down motion that you see in the very first tracing, right, where it goes up and down, that's just something, could be something as simple as the patient taking a big deep breath, okay, right, because those electrodes are moving. Something on the bottom would be something like hair or the patient touching or scratching an electrode or moving their arm. So this is why we want the patient to sit as still as possible when we are evaluating them, because we want to get a clean tracing. So things that you need to know. Your EKG obviously is printed on this really delightful specialized paper, graph paper. That paper moves at 25 millimeters a second, okay? So this is actually my Insta handle also. Your time is horizontal. Your amplitude is vertical, okay? So if you're counting side to side, you're counting in time, okay? So one of these small boxes on the graph paper is 0.4 seconds. There are 5 small boxes in one big box. We're back in like kindergarten, right? Like a little basic math. So 4 times 5 is 20. Move your decimal over. This is 0.2 seconds. A P wave, or sorry, the distance between a P wave and the QRS should be no more than 0.2 seconds. Okay? When you're printing out a 12 lead, that is a 12-second clip of the heart rate. Things that people don't seem to always understand. This is occurring, all of these leads, so you have lead 1, 2, and 3. Yep, I know, the annotator sucks. These are occurring at the same period in time, okay? These are occurring before these. But these are at the same time. These are at the same time, but they're occurring 3 seconds after this one. Oh, I'm done. All right. Your vertical axis provides amplitude. Okay, so up and down, each little box is 1 millimeter. You will see on the left-hand side of your EKG when it prints out a calibration bar. Just see if I have a picture. I don't have a picture. The calibration bar. Calibration bar is just this big old square. Kind of looks like this. Okay, it's telling you that it's going up 2 big boxes, okay, because there's 5 boxes here, so the standard calibration is 10. If you ever look at your EKG, you can zoom in. You have the opportunity to zoom in. So that calibration bar will be potentially 4 big boxes, which means you've doubled the size, right? Because if you have a little itty bitty EKG tracing and you want to look at it closer, you can make it bigger. Okay. But your standard calibration is 10 millimeters. So when you're looking at something like an EKG for STEMI, you say, all right, here's my, it goes like that. You're counting how many boxes are between your isoelectric line here and that J point. And we'll talk about that more when we get to 12 leads. But that's why you need to know what your boxes are, because if it's 1 millimeter or 2 millimeters or 3 millimeters of elevation, the doctor's going to want to know that. Okay? Questions? You're all still with me? Nope, I think everybody's asleep. You all here? Wellness check.
Present.
Here.
We're all good.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
Hopefully they've gone over this like 5 times in these mini lessons that we've had, so that's sort of everybody's zone out.
Right, that's fine. Like I can speed through stuff too. Like if I don't
No,
really
I think
know
it's
what
good.
the
I think the repetitiveness is good, so don't
Yeah.
go any faster. I think we all need that.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely don't speed through it.
Okay. So we talked about the initial electrical. Someone feed you.
Jesus, somebody's in a storm.
All right, I'm ready to mute now.
Whoever's in the car needs to mute.
Yeah. So we talked about the cardiac potential tracing. Now we're going to talk about the EKG tracing. Each time that you see a tracing on the EKG, it represents a conduction of an electrical impulse, not necessarily a mechanical impulse. Okay? So you see somebody who's got a really fast heart rate, you still need to check their pulse, right? You can have a patient who's in VTAC who has no pulse, right? They're going to show electric, but there's no mechanical. Okay? Always make sure the two match. I can't tell you the number of times I got a patient who's showing is like 150 on the monitor, you check their actual pulse rate and it's only 40 because only 40 of those 150 beats are being transmitted. Okay, so make sure that the two match, because you can't be like, oh yeah, its pulse is 100 and like it's actually 20. Like that looks really poor on you that you didn't do a proper assessment.
Literally had to teach 2 med students to do that yesterday. I was like,
Oh.
I don't think that's right. That's not what the patient looks like. And I'm like, did you
Yeah.
guys check a pulse? And she's like, no. I'm like, seriously?
Yeah, you'd be amazed. Like a lot of medical professionals rely very heavily on their like technology, and it's not always the best. Okay, so always make sure that you line the two up. You have a number of different parts of the heart, right? So we talked about how the P wave is your atrias, your QRS is your ventricles, right? Your T wave here is the repolarization, okay? It's the electric being reset. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more in depth now. Every waveform should begin and end at the isoelectric line, okay? Only thing that you won't necessarily see isoelectric lines on are your fib your fib rhythms, your AFib or your VFib. AFib doesn't have an isoelectric line. It's called a fibrillatory baseline. Okay. VFib doesn't have a baseline at all. It's just squiggling all over the place. Okay. So everything will begin and end at the isoelectric line. There's nothing going on. The heart is at rest. Okay. You will have a longer isoelectric line in your bradycardic rhythms than you will in your tachycardic rhythms, okay? Because there's just more space between the beat. When you are when you go to 12 leads, when you're looking at your ST elevations, you should compare it to the isoelectric line before the P wave, okay? Because that one's unaffected by ST changes like after that come after. So you want to use the P side isoelectric line when you're looking at 12 leads for evaluation. You are going to need to know these times. Okay, these times are essential. They will quiz you on them till ad infinitum. Okay, your P wave here in green represents your atrial depolarization. There's not a lot of muscle mass, so it's not very tall, and it's usually very quick. Okay, again, not a lot of muscle mass, moves through really fast. It should be 0.1 seconds or less. 0.1 being what? 0.4, 0.04, 0.04, 0.08. So it should be no longer than about 3 little boxes long. High, it should be relatively cute. Okay, it should be no round. It should not be bigger than one big box. Okay, you want to make sure that they're kind of adorable. For the love of God, hold on 1 second. I just had a work thing pop up that's really dumb. Give me 2 seconds. Ah, yeah, I'll send it to you. Sorry. You're supposed to interview somebody today, and apparently 20 minutes. I'm sending. Oh, we'll talk. I'm trying to hire someone for over a month, and they just sent the interview for it, and the interview's in 15 minutes.
Which
0.
job?
We have a per diem medic spot that's been open for 2 months because HR doesn't want to do their job. Literally had to escalate it to the VP to get her to do her job. We had 5 applicants, and it took her over a month to send us any of them to look at.
This is Nassau County, right?
Yeah.
So I just sat in on interviews with 15 medics. So
Mhm.
if you want to send me any of the names just to, double check that it wasn't anybody we had ride along and was totally fucking crazy, let me know.
Oh, I can vouch. I can vouch for
The one that you're hiring.
Yes, he's most likely, yes. He's a POC 25. He's one of mine.
Oh,
So,
I met a
yeah.
POC 25 kid yesterday from EAB in the trauma room. Very nice
Oh,
kid.
nice. Who?
Maybe Alex. I can't remember I honestly can't. Cute kid, blonde hair, tall and skinny.
Yes, Alec. He's yes, he's adorable.
He was so cute. He was like, he was just like, he's telling me these things. I'm like, dude, I'm like 49 years old. Like, he was very sweet though. Very, very sweet. He was like he's like, go listen to lung sounds. You need that in your phys dep. Go, go. I know I already tubed him, but go listen.
Good. Good. Get all the insider information.
It was very sweet. He was a very nice kid. He's like, every time I come here, I'm gonna come find you and talk to you. I'm like, okay.
Good. Hold on 1 sec. I have to coordinate all this nonsense. All right, so P waves, right? Or that's pretty much it. So then next we have your PR interval. So this is the pause that the electric takes at the AV node, okay? It should come back to the isoelectric line. You will have very, very few instances where you will see that not coming down to the isoelectric line. It's extremely rare, and I've seen it a grand total of once. And it's actually an atrial MI. They're very rare. So if you find one and you're like, what is this? You have an elevation in the PR segment, drag that to the hospital and be like, look, doc, look. And they're going to go like, I don't know what you're talking about. And you're going to be like, no, it's really cool. Yeah, I literally have saw it once, and I was in medic school and was reading an EKG textbook, and I was like working with a medic at Hunter, and I was like, hey, have you ever heard about this? He's like, what? I'm like, an atrial MI. And he's like, no. And I was like, look, you have an elevation in the PR segment. Like, it's indicative of that. He's like, oh, that's really cool. We did one job that day. He had been a medic for 35 years, and he had never seen it. We walk in, and this lady she had a syncopal episode, and she was having elevations in her PR segment. He's like, you must be kidding me right now. And I was like, oh. It was kind of interesting. So this is giving that you're giving that the ventricles an opportunity to refill. Okay, so you need that. It shouldn't be too brief. It should also not be too long. That's when you start getting into what's called heart blocks, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So it should be about 0.12 to 0.2 seconds long, no more than one big box. Next up, you have your QRS complex. This should be what's called the tight and narrow complex. They're sexy, right? They are usually very brief, anywhere from 0.8 to 0.1 seconds, which like about 2 to 3 little boxes. And they should be about 5 to 15 millimeters high. Anything longer than that, like up and down, any more than 3 big boxes, you're usually looking at a person who has who's having a ventricular hypertrophy, which is indicative of untreated hypertension, which opens up the doors for all sorts of other issues. Your QRS complex is always going to be multidirectional, right? It's kind of got to come back up, right? We talked about this already a little bit. As the AV node sits high, it goes down the septum and then comes back up. So as it comes back up is the up and down that you're seeing. Your first negative deflection, or anything dropping below the, let's see if anything dropping below the isoelectric line is considered a Q wave. Not every EKG or every lead will have a Q wave, okay? And in some cases, a Q can be considered pathological, but we'll talk about that again a little bit later. Your R wave is the first positive deflection, so it can go from an isoelectric line up into an R wave, okay? And then the S is the negative deflection after the R wave. Okay, so you can have a combination of things based on the different morphologies of whatever lead you're looking in. Okay, and then you can also have different morphologies based on if you have somebody who has like aberrant aberrancy. That's the word I'm looking for. So patients with left bundle branch blocks, right bundle branch blocks, but we'll talk about those later. Okay, that's not a right now convo. Hold on, sorry. After the QRS, you have what's called the ST segment, okay? This is the earlier part of repolarization. So we talked about that before, right? You have your, that period of time of refractory period. Absolute, nothing is going to make these ventricles contract or be depolarized again between the bottom of the QRS complex and the middle of the T wave, okay? Not going to happen. because all the electrolytes are in flux. So your ST segment is also what we're really looking at when we talk about MIs or STEMIs, right? ST is the ST segment being elevated. Once it comes off of that isoelectric line, it starts to be a concern. There are periods or different situations where that concern is like minimized, and we'll talk about those when we get to 12 leads. Or apparently right now. So when that ST segment, if you want to get the annotator, right, you have your ST segment. It starts at this J point. I want a pink, give me pink. All right, starts at that J point. That J point sometimes can be hard to identify, but it's usually that transitional area, right? So it might not look like a complete right angle. It might be a little squirrely like here, right? So if you have a J point that looks like this, that would be considered elevation, right? It's not on the isoelectric line, because look at the isoelectric line from your P interval, right? You drag that straight across, it's up and elevated. Over here, it could also be considered elevated as well, okay? But then there's a difference, you have differences between, we'll talk about that later. Then you could have a J wave. This J wave is usually indicative of a whatchamacallit, of a sorry, 900 different things today. Early repolarization, which is a completely normal variant, especially in younger patients. But we'll talk about that more when we get to 12 leads. All right, now you have your T waves. Okay, your T waves represent ventricular myocardial cells repolarizing, right? So you really don't get to see the atrias repolarizing because it gets eaten up in the QRS complex, okay? So you might see it every once in a while if you have a longer PR segment, but it would look just like this. And then go into the QRS. Well, there, I repositioned it. All right. You just have another wave, but most of the time, this downward deflection of the atrial repolarization is eaten up by this much more significant electrical motion seen in the ventricles. Okay. When the ventricles repolarize, there's nothing opposing them, so you get to see it clear as day. Okay, and that just becomes your T wave. Okay. It's usually the first deviation away from the isoelectric line after the QRS. You can have other waves that pop up, and they're usually called a U wave. We'll talk about those later. It's usually an electrolyte imbalance, okay? Come on, there we go. Your T wave should be asymmetrical, okay? It kind of comes, hold on, I'm gonna get my squiggler back. It should come up sloping and then kind of come down, sort of like a ski jump that gives, like you're gonna go and you're gonna have this little dude, he's gonna be like, right, and you have this more dramatic down. Any T wave that is symmetrical, where if you took your EKG and you folded it right down the middle of that T wave, it's the same on either side, not good. It could be a number of different things, but it's just not good. Okay. Sometimes you'll see a biphasic T wave, not necessarily a bad thing. Okay. Not necessarily a good thing either. If you have something like a broad and slow T wave or a flatter T wave, it could be due to electrolyte imbalances. If you have a notched T wave like that, it could be an indicative of aberrancy, but you would potentially also see your QRS be a little funky. It won't be cute and tight and narrow. It would probably be like a little more bunny-eared shape, right? But these are the ones down here on the bottom that you're going to want to be very aware of. All right, well, I quit with this thing. All right, so so you have these your T wave should always be positive, should be pretty much in the same direction as the QRS, okay? Because there are some leads where the QRS is negative, the T wave is also negative. your T wave is in the opposite direction, it's either a sign of ischemia, as you see right here. It could be a sign of strain, which is usually indicative again of like a hypertrophic issue. Or you have a bundle branch block, which again we'll get into later. There's one medication that we deal with that you don't want to administer if a patient has a prolonged QT interval. So that means that the T wave is really long, or it doesn't pop up. It's really far away from the QRS. Anyone know what medication that is? No, not digitalis.
Fran.
Say that again?
Was it Zofran?
Yes, it is. Very good. So if you have a patient who has prolonged QT, it could be a completely normal variant for them, but it could cause them issues if they're getting Zofran. This is why we use cardiac monitoring for patients getting Zofran. Among the fact that nausea could be a potential issue or a potential symptom of a heart attack. So just keep that in mind. So your QT interval, right, is the beginning of the ventricular depolarization, right? So right here, the Q wave, right? These things are pretty clearly labeled to the end of the T wave. Okay, that is the entire interval of the ventricles. Okay, from beginning to end, depolarization to repolarization. They're ready to go again. That QT is very dependent upon whether or not it's a fast heart rate or a slow heart rate. A bradycardic heart rate will potentially have a slower or a longer QT, whereas a tachycardic, you don't have time for that long QT interval. We talked about the absolute, right? So from the beginning of the Q to the middle of the T, absolutely nothing is going to cause that heart to depolarize again. And then you have from the top of the T to the end of the T, a significant amount of electricity or another stimulus can cause the heart to depolarize again, but it's going to take a bunch. Okay. Things that we kind of look at when we're determining the regularity of a heart is the R to R interval. So we take the top of the R wave to the next top of the R wave. And this is something that you can do with a piece of with an EKG paper. You fold it in half and you can line up your R's. And if they're hitting at this, very close to the same spot, it's a regular heart rate. You can also count how, and this is one of those rough estimates. You have a 12-second strip. You can count how many R waves are happening in 10 seconds, or how many R waves are happening in 3 seconds, and multiply it out to get a rough estimate of the heart rate. Questions, thoughts, concerns? Okay. There we go. So, first things first, when we're analyzing an EKG, always make sure that you're assessing your patient before you assess the EKG. Patients can potentially have a funky looking EKG but be perfectly fine, and that could be normal for them. So you want to say, hey, is this patient sick, right? Is this patient complaining of chest pain? Is this complaining of shortness of breath, nausea, vomiting? Do they just look crappy, right? We need to know that first, because that's going to determine how we interpret the EKG, right? So if I have a patient who's looking super healthy and I get to, step 2 and their heart rate is 40, am I going to be as concerned if I have a patient who's gray and diaphoretic and their heart rate is 40? No. So next, you're going to check what the heart rate is. A lot of the monitors will give you a number. You should always confirm the electric heart rate with your mechanical heart rate. Then are your QRSs looking normal, or are they looking a little funky, right? Are they cute, tight, and narrow, or are they really bizarre looking? The second you move into bizarre looking is your level of suspicion should increase a little bit. Why am I saying that you should look at QRS wave complexes before P waves?
The quick reference by seeing if it's tight or narrow or if it's wide and bizarre, it's going to give you a direct indication that something's going on.
You want to
Potentially.
see if there is a QRS with every P.
Yeah, you do, but why are we looking at the QRS complexes before we look for P waves?
I'm not sure because Scott told us to always look for P waves before the QRS.
Can you survive with no QRS complexes?
No.
No.
Can you survive without atrial P waves?
Yes.
Yes.
So let's flip-flop that mentality a little bit. Yes, when you're analyzing the EKG for what the rhythm is, you should see if there's P waves because you're getting disembodied P wave EKGs. If you have a patient in front of you and they're looking a little dead and they only have P waves and they have no QRSs, are you going to do CPR? Are you going to like do something for the patient? Hopefully, right? Hopefully. You can survive without P waves, you can't survive without QRSs. So let's prioritize when you're looking at it, making sure that make sure that you you have QRSs because you're kind of shit out of luck if you don't. That makes you have to do way more work for the patient. And then yes, what's your relationship between the P waves and the QRSs? Yeah, P waves is a ventricular standstill. If you have just you have every QRS has a P wave, you're solid. Right? If you have any sort of variant, that's going to change what your interpretation of the EKG is. So, analyzing the rate. So this one is a lot of these analyzing the rates are when you have a regular heart rate and you're just kind of like eyeballing it. The best way to analyze the rate is to take a pulse. Period. End of story. Okay. This is also a guesstimate for the most part, and it really is only accurate if the heart rate is both regular and more than 50. So what you're going to do is you're going to look at your EKG. You're going to find an R that lands on a big box. I could do some really crappy doodling. All right, so you're going to find an R wave. Here's your P, here's your QRS, right? Then you're going to count the number of boxes until your next R wave. So if my next R wave is here, that's 1 big box, 2 big box, 3 big box. My rate's approximately 75. Now, if I move this, oh, really? The one time I want to move the damn thing. If I move that over either direction, it's going to either increase or decrease, right? So you're going to count your R to R interval. The annotator is the worst in the history of the world. Okay, memorize these. 1 big box is 300, 2 is 150. This is really helpful for you if you're going to be looking at SVTs, right? Because if you have QRSs that are closer than 2 big boxes, you're in SVT range. Period. End of story. Okay? Just based on rate alone. You can also do the R to R method, very similar, right? You're going to count the number of small boxes between your R waves and divide by 1500. No one's doing this. No one's doing this. This is for your slower rates. It's easier to just take a pulse and just take a pulse, right? You can determine if you can look at the monitor, take a pulse, and if every time you feel a beat, you see a thing, it's the same, right? Then you don't have to worry about non-conducted beats. You can also do the 6-second mount method. You take a 6-second strip and then count how many QRS complexes are in that 6-second strip, and then multiply by 10, or add a 0 to the end of it. And that's about what your heart rate is going to be. Again, not super accurate, really depends on the heart rate being regular. You can also whip out the calipers. Do they still make you guys get calipers?
No, but Scott
Vinny
did
showed
say-
us how to use a paper, draw on it lines, and then just match it up.
Way easier. Way easier. So basically, the heart rate is going to have, or even a regular heart rate is going to have a little bit of irregularity to it. Okay, every time you take a deep breath or a breath, it changes your intrathoracic pressure, which causes your heart rate to alter a little bit. Totally normal, but that normality is about 4 small boxes. Okay, any larger variation than that is considered an irregular rhythm. And we have a number of irregular rhythms that we're going to look at that you're going to be like, oh, gotcha. For example, your regular rhythms are going to be your sinus, right? If they come, it's predictable. You can like absolutely tell what's going on. You can also have a regularly irregular rhythm. These are like your second degree heart blocks, for example, right? They can be irregularly irregular. You can have occasionally irregular, right? When you have somebody who might be throwing a PAC or a PVC or PJC in there, right? Those are occasionally irregular. Your only irregularly irregular rhythm that generates life is AFib. VFib is also irregularly irregular, but we're not really worried about that at that point. We're just going to shock them better. Okay? So if you ever see a test question, it's like, which heart rhythm is irregularly irregular? It's AFib. That's it. End of story. Period. Move on. So after that, you're also going to look at your QRS complexes. Sorry, it's a stretch. Right? You should have a QRS complex that's tight and narrow, but it should be about 0.1 second wide. Okay, you should be able to see a little bit of light. I don't think I've ever really seen a narrow QRS where it's like super, super tight like that. You might see those in patients who, like pediatric patients in SVT, but again, you'll usually see most of your QRSs that you're going to see, if they're tight, they're normal. Excuse me. Now, you can have up top what is considered a wide QRS, right? Anything bigger than 0.12 seconds. How many little boxes is that?
3 little.
More than 3.
Perfect. 3 little boxes or bigger is a conduction abnormality. It might be VTAC. It might be a left bundle branch. It might be a right bundle branch. We'll learn about those more, okay? But if it's funky looking to begin with, it's going to catch your eye and you're going to go, oh, that's not right. Okay. So just keep that in mind. It also could be a pacemaker. Sometimes pacemakers will give them a funky looking QRS. Then you're going to look at P waves, right? So in lead 2, your P waves should be positive. Okay. Right. We use lead 2 as our main monitoring lead. P waves should come regularly. They should come before every QRS, right? And they should all look the same. If 1 or 2 P waves starts looking a little funky and they don't fall in the right interval, it's probably a PAC. You can have a number of different morphologies, though, that basically kind of will indicate that there's other things going on, like mostly an atrial enlargement. And atrial enlargements are usually secondary to either pulmonary issues or hypertension. Okay, and we'll talk about those more later. So now you want to see what your PR interval is, right? So we talked about that. It should be shorter than 0.2. Okay. If there's anything less than or more than that, right, where your P wave is kind of far away from your QRS, that's considered what's called a first degree heart block most of the time. Okay, if it's just farther than 0.2 seconds away from your QRS and there's no other irregularities, it's a first degree heart block. And again, we'll review this again in a little bit. If it's shorter than 0.12, three little boxes, right, from the beginning of your P to the QRS, there is more than likely there is an accessory pathway. This is your Wolff-Parkinson-White, okay? Again, we'll talk about this more in the future. Just you want to make sure that your PR interval is consistent throughout. Questions, thoughts, concerns that we need to address right now before we move on?
There was one in the chat.
Oh, I didn't see it. What was it?
If lead 2 is the main monitoring, what is that what the 3-lead basic rhythm comes from, or do all the pieces of the 3-lead ECG, EKG come from the basic rhythm?
So that's like a semantics thing. Okay, so basically your basic rhythm that your patient is having is going to be consistent no matter what lead you're looking at. But we use lead 2 as the main monitoring because it does give us a good view of the atrias and the ventricles. Okay, it was like one of the first leads that they kind of like, hey, cool, we get to see everything. So the basic rhythm that the patient is experiencing will be consistent throughout every lead that you're looking at, unless it changes. Like, so for example, if a patient is in sinus tachycardia because they're dehydrated and you look at that, it will be sinus tachycardia in every single lead. If you then go and give them fluids and their heart rate starts to come down and they've now moved into sinus rhythm, that's their new baseline rhythm, and that will be the same in every single lead. That makes sense? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. It's just, yeah, it's just a vision. That's why we use lead 2, because it's a good visualization of the entire heart. Any other questions? All right. I feel like you guys have probably gotten a lot of this already, but we're going to go over it again. Maybe. Forward. There we go. All right. So your SA node, your main pacemaker in the heart, it lives in the top part of your right atria, and it is the boss. It gives you your normal heart rate. Most, like 90, about 99% of the world. There's a couple people who have, other issues, but, we'll get to that when we get to that. The rhythms that you can get from an SA node include sinus rhythm, sinus bradycardia, sinus tachycardia, sinus dysrhythmia, and a sinus arrest. Sinus arrest is really the sinus isn't doing what it's supposed to do, but we'll get there. So, first up, sinus rhythm. The regular normal rhythm, it is a rate between 60 and 100. Everyone has a normal, like their own normal intrinsic rate based on what their body needs and their heart's function, et cetera, et cetera. Women have a little bit of a higher heart rate in sinus than men do. In lead 2, you will have an upright P wave that has a 1-to-1 ratio with all QRSs, and you will have an upright, normal, tight QRS complex. Your PR interval will fall within its normal range, provided that there's no AV block. Okay, and we'll talk about AV blocks in a little bit, because when you're identifying that, it's a 2-part component. Okay. Sinus bradycardia, same exact classifications for all of your P and your PR and QRSs. It's still a regular rhythm, but the rate is less than 60. For example, my normal resting heart rate is about 49, so I'm always in a sinus bradycardia at baseline. If I'm up and moving around, it's probably in the 60s or 70s, so as a sinus rhythm. Sinus bradycardia does not necessarily need to be like pathological. If you're looking at somebody who looks like they, bench press Volkswagens, there might be in a sinus bradycardia normally, okay? You have, you know, elite runners or even just people who work out regularly. They might just chill in a sinus bradycardia. The sinus bradycardia becomes an issue when their blood pressure starts tanking and they start not feeling well, okay? Or it starts getting too low. The slowest I've ever seen a sinus brady was at 18. It wasn't very conducive to making him feel good. So we talked about most of these things already, right? So it could be completely normal. It could be because the patient is very ill. They might have increased parasympathetic tone. You see this in little old people on the toilet. Hypothermia will decrease the heart rate. Heart attacks that involve the SA node can cause an MI. Most of the time, patients who are having an MI who fall into a bradycardic rhythm have a poorer, like a worse outcome than patients who never become bradycardic. You will see this sometimes when you go into the, like if you have a STEMI and you're going into the cath lab, they'll say, did the patient ever become bradycardic? Okay, just keep that in mind. That's a good question they might ask. Sometimes drugs, right, heart medications can cause overdoses, or if you have an overdose, it can cause bradycardia. If you look at your protocols, and this is where I want you guys to start putting your protocols and the lectures together. If you look at your protocols for sinus bradycardia or for bradycardic rhythms, they give you a number of options that you can do. So the first thing that they usually do for bradycardia is they want you to give them a 250 milliliter bolus of saline and atropine 0.5. You can also then ask for vasopressors, right? Your dopamine, norepi, your push epi, or you can move into transcutaneous pacing, which is TCP on the bottom there. Okay, these are the different options that you have to fix bradycardia, because the whole idea is if the patient is having quote unquote compromised cardiac output, hypotension, signs and symptoms of shock, you can fix the slow heart rate.
Nicole, I have a question.
Go ahead.
I thought norepi does not have an effect on the heart rate.
It
I thought
doesn't. It doesn't as much as dopamine does, but it will improve blood pressure.
Okay.
So like
Right,
so for example, if you have a patient who's having a STEMI, right? They're having a massive STEMI, the heart literally can't tolerate beating any faster. The norepi will dilate the blood vessels to make it that the heart doesn't have to pump as much blood to improve the blood pressure. Does that make sense?
But won't that have a negative impact on the sinus bradycardia?
No, so the bradycardia is staying the same. You're just making the vessel, like the body, the size of your vasculature smaller. So it's improving the preload because you're getting more blood return to the heart.
So then you still have to fix the sinus bradycardia though.
Well, but the problem with the sinus bradycardia is that the heart is damaged.
Okay.
So you're helping that heart rate of 40 be more effective. Remember, you have stroke volume and heart rate. So if you can't touch the heart rate because you have an MI, but you can improve the stroke volume by reducing the capacity of the body's blood vessels, then you even out your cardiac output and you can improve the blood pressure.
Okay. Thank you.
Good question, though. No problem. Great question. All right, sinus tachycardia. Same criteria as sinus rhythm, but your rate is now over 100. Sinus tachycardia can be completely normal if your patient has a fever or was exercising recently or is in pain, okay, or has took too much cocaine, okay? Any of these things can cause sinus tachycardia. There's some people who live in a tachycardic state, like their normal resting heart rates in like the 110s or something. Could be totally normal for them, okay? Most of the time, or it could be a shock, right? Sinus tachycardia can be in response to shock. Remember, we talked about this before. If you have a patient who's hypovolemic, their stroke volume is lower, so their heart rate's going to go up. Okay, so this is your compensatory mechanism. But what you need to do is to treat the underlying cause. Okay, so that might be oxygen fluid, it might be pain management, it might need to be, you know, if you have a patient who's septic, it might need to be norepinephrine, okay? Because again, you're minimizing the capacity of the blood vessels so that the stroke volume improves. So you have a number of different ways, a number of different tools in your toolbox to fix that. Sinus dysrhythmia, you might see this especially in younger children, because when they take a breath, it's going to impact their heart a little bit more. Completely, usually normal, usually not something that you're going to really do anything for. Supportive care, for the most part. Older adults, it might be secondary to heart disease. Again, not a lot that you're going to do for this. It's monitor and transport. Sinus arrest. You will see a sinus arrest when the SA node fails to fire in regular rhythm. You'll have this big long pause, okay? Everything else is normal except for when it drops the beat. Okay? So, sometimes this might just be because there's either too much parasympathetic tone, the patient might be hypoxic, there might be some sort of electrolyte imbalance going on, damage to the SA node from ischemia or an MI. Okay, so it can cause the heart to just stand still for a little bit. Some patients are going to be more sensitive to this than others. It depends on how frequent the sinus arrest is, right? You can have a sinus arrest that looks, for all intents and purposes, as a severe bradycardia, okay? Or you can have little runs where the patient's just like, I don't feel good. Like, it feels like they might complain of palpitations, like their heart's fluttering, because the heart's like, we're ready to go. And the SA node's like, oh, shit, yeah, no, we meant to do that. So you might see this here and there. Again, your patient might have very vague kind of complaints, may or may not have symptoms of compromised cardiac output. If they are experiencing significant levels of sinus arrest, you might want to try atropine, right? Because it could be that they've also had some sort of in that realm, or transcutaneous pacing to keep them regular. Any questions about this? Move on. Nope. All right, cool. So if your SA node is not doing necessarily what it's supposed to do, or it's being overridden by another area inside the atrias, we are now moving here into the atrial rhythms. So this is one of my favorites. Don't ask why. You don't see it all that often. You have to look relatively closely in order to kind of determine if this is going on. A wandering atrial pacemaker, you will see at least 3 different morphologies for your P waves. Okay, so you might have a completely regular looking rhythm. It's a little funky here and there, but your P waves all look different. That means that maybe the SA node is firing, but you've got 2 other places in the atrias that are a little irritated that are also participating. They're throwing in their 2 cents. They're like, hey guys, it's my turn. And they're like, SA node's like, what the hell just happened, dude? No, I'm in charge. And it's like, nah. And then his buddy also does the same thing. So it'll usually look relatively normal. You won't necessarily be able to pick it out of a lineup, but if you look really closely, you'll see that you have 3 different looking P waves. Again, a lot of your atrial issue, a lot of potential heart issues could be tied to digoxin. They don't really use digoxin as much anymore, so you don't really see it like that kind of issue. Most of the time it'll be like a vagal stimulation or some other underlying heart disease. For the most part, your patient won't necessarily need you to do anything, right? If there's some sort of underlying cause, such as hypoxia or an MI, you fix that. You're not going to fix a wandering atrial pacemaker. Another thing that you're really not going to fix is a premature atrial complex. This is going to be just one funky looking P wave followed by a QRS, okay? Usually because it's coming from the atrias, it's going to still follow the normal pathway when it gets to the AV node. It's just coming a little earlier in the normal cycle, right? So you have just somebody else kind of popping up out of nowhere and being like, hey, I'm just throwing in a little premature beat, okay? Again, a lot of the times PACs are completely just normal. Your heart just be like, ah, and we'll give you an extra beat. If you have patients who have underlying heart disease and are having PACs a lot, it can lead to a supraventricular dysrhythmia. But again, unless they start moving into something that's unstable or resulting in cardiac compromise, you're just going to observe and go to the hospital. SVT, this is where it's at. Okay, these are going to be the fun calls where you get to do stuff most of the time. A lot of the times SVTs are broken by you taking out a large needle and going, I'm going to start an IV, and the patient will self-convert. Supraventricular tachycardias are over a rate of 150 in adults, 180 in pediatrics. Pediatrics can be also, like infants, can be as high as 220 or higher, okay? It depends on the age range of the child. Children, you don't generally do as much for SVTs as you do for adults because they can tolerate those fast heart rates a lot longer than adults can. So you will have a very regular, normal looking rhythm. You'll have P waves before every QRS, but it might be hard for you to tell the difference between a P wave and a T wave, okay? Because they start to overlap because the rate is so quick. A lot of people have SVTs. A lot of people will tell you, oh, I feel like my heart's palpating. A lot of people will also say, hey, I have a history of SVT. Last time it took them 12 of adenosine to fix me. And you're going to go, okie dokie. You can't slow the monitor, but what you can do is you can actually pull the paper. So if you hit print and then you take the paper and kind of pull it out faster than it's coming out, you can actually stretch the printing, and you might be able to see the difference between the P waves and the T waves. It's helpful sometimes also for AFibs to do that, to determine if it's an AFib or something else. But sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Some people will go into SVT just out of nowhere, overexertion, stress, to caffeine. If they start becoming symptomatic, right, where they, you get there and maybe their blood pressure is still okay, you're going to treat them with adenosine, okay? You're going to get that IV, you're going to give them 6, you're going to bolus it fast, you're going to flush it fast, and you're going to say, okay, cool. If you have a patient whose blood pressure starts to tank or they start to become AMS, then you're going to start moving into synchronized cardioversion, right? It's medicine or Edison, okay? If they're still stable, medicine. If they're becoming unstable, Edison, electric. You're going to cardiovert. You can do vagal or talk the patient through doing vagal maneuvers, which is where they bear down against a closed glottis, right? So like if you're bearing down to poop, that's a vagal maneuver. We do not endorse carotid sinus massage because especially if the patient's older, you can flick off a piece of plaque and cause a stroke. Not on my watch. There are a number of different SVTs. Aren't necessarily going to determine one or the other. PSVT is an SVT, is a proximal SVT. It's where you see it start and then stop. Okay, you will see the beginning and entering. Atrial tachycardia, again, like a lot of these, you're not necessarily going to be able to tell the difference. You're not going to necessarily treat them any differently. Okay, that's it. These are the different ones that you might see. You can also see atrial flutter. I know the rate says 250 to 350, but that's the rate of the atrias, not necessarily the rate of the QRSs. So if you look, atrial flutter has a very characteristic shaped wave. It's not a P wave. It's actually called an F wave for flutter. And it's what's called the sawtooth. Okay, so like you're very like it looks like a saw. If you took a saw, turned it upside down, that's what your wave is going to look like. Again, this doesn't necessarily have an isoelectric line because you're constantly fluttering. A flutter and AFib can hang out at the same time. A flutter usually devolves into an AFib. But A flutter is a little more organized where you will have a ratio between the number of flutter waves to QRSs. Most of the time it's about 3-to-1. Your A flutter, I've seen slow A flutters. I've seen slow A flutters at a rate of 50. Okay. So just because the atrias are going quickly does not necessarily mean that the QRS is. Again, if this can be seen in a lot of middle-aged people who, especially hypertension or other heart issues, it usually can be seen devolving into an AFib, which is, again, it could be a potentially well-tolerated and managed heart rate or heart rhythm. Again, if you have a patient who starts to have a atrial flutter that's at a very significant rate over 150, you can treat it just like an SVT. The one thing that you're going to change when you start seeing your rapid AFibs and AFlutters is that rather than using adenosine as your primary, diltiazem, your cardizem, or your calcium channel blocker is usually a little more successful in terminating that rhythm. That one is a call to medical control, though. You will still potentially synchronize cardiovert if the patient is hemodynamically unstable. AFib. AFib is your most irregular rhythm, okay? You do not have an isoelectric line. You only, or P waves, you just have these like fibrillatory squiggles in between QRSs. A lot of people who have a history of AFib may be on medications like beta blockers, calcium channel blockers, or a combination that will actually put them back into a sinus rhythm. It controls the fibrillation of the atrias. So just because someone says, I have a history of AFib, does not necessarily mean that you're going to see AFib on the monitor. Just to keep that in mind. But this is generally what it looks like. It is irregularly irregular. The QRSs are going to do what they want to do when they want to do it. That AV node is being pummeled with electrical impulses. So some stuff will get through and some stuff won't. Most of the time, chronic AFib is associated with an underlying heart disease. The area right around where the aortic valve, that's actually where AFib usually generates from. So when they go in to do ablations, that's usually the spot that they ablate to try to reduce AFib. AFib can be a completely normal sudden onset for patients, or not normal, but it can cause a sudden onset after like acute stress in younger adults. Endurance athletes tend to have issues because you're really working that area around that aortic valve. So sometimes it just gets tired. Patients who have had an aortic valve replacement might also have atrial fibrillation because you've now damaged that area around the heart. Cardizem, again, is going to be your primary preferred drug, especially if the patient is has a good blood pressure, because it will also tank the blood pressure. Amiodarone is usually used if they have a little bit of a lower blood pressure, and synchronized cardioversion, obviously, if they are completely hemodynamically unstable. Same thing. AFib with rapid ventricular response, so you'll see RVR, can cause significant symptoms. Okay, they might be really out of it, but it also could be something else. So don't necessarily treat AFib with RVR with medication right away. So a lot of the times, if you have patients who live in AFib all of the time and they become hypovolemic or start hemorrhaging, their compensatory mechanism is going to be to increase their heart rate. Except when they increase their heart rate, it's still in an AFib rhythm. Okay, so you might have someone who's shocky at a heart rate of 130, and you're like, that looks a little too fast. I want to treat it. But your treatment should be maybe fluids before you start doing cardizem or amiodarone or synchronized cardioversion. This is where getting a good patient assessment and good patient history is going to really pay off, okay? You don't want to go taking away somebody's compensatory heart rate because you didn't do a thorough assessment. All right, questions, thoughts, concerns?
Could you repeat that last part?
About the compensatory heart rate.
Yeah.
So imagine you go to a house, okay? You have an 80-year-old female, history of AFib. She says she's not feeling well. She's been having nausea, diarrhea for 3 days, hasn't been able to keep any food or water down. You put her on the monitor, and she's in AFib at a rate of 130 to 150. Because remember, AFibs will have a heart range because it's going to jump up and down. And you're like, oh, 150, that qualifies SVT. I want to treat it. But is it a heart problem, or is it like a dehydration problem because she's been having diarrhea and vomiting? So if you treat it like it's a heart problem and not support it with fluids, you can take away that compensatory mechanism that's giving her a potentially normal blood pressure, right? Just like any other compensated shock patient, right? You have a patient who's been injured and their blood pressure is still like 110/70, but their heart rate's 130 because they've been made significantly injured. You don't want to reduce that heart rate through cardioversion. You want to reduce that heart rate by supplementing them with fluids and treating the underlying cause. So always keep in the back of your mind that just because a patient is tachycardic doesn't necessarily mean that you have to fix the heart. You have to see if there's underlying causes first. Okay, good. Any other questions? All right, cool. So moving on to the AV junction, all right? The AV node is also called the junction, all right? Don't let those two different terms confuse you, okay? I don't know why they decided they want to call it the junction. I guess it's sort of because it's the gatekeeper to the ventricles. So first things first, you might see a patient who's going to throw some PJCs at you, okay? This is the AV node decides it doesn't like being second in command and just going to throw a rhythm out there. If you look right here in kind of the middle, right here, that's your PJC, right? So if you look at this complex, there's no P wave before it because it didn't come from the atrias. It came from the AV node. So it's not necessarily stimulating the atrias. It has the potential to, and if it does, you'll see everyone else will be, that's really hard to see. Everyone else will be upright, and you'll have like one P wave that goes like this, and you'll have a normal looking QRS, okay? You'll have normal looking QRSs with the PJC because it's still going down the normal pathway, okay? You will just see that either there will be zero P wave or an upside down P wave, okay? That's really your only indication. Again, PJCs don't really mean anything. It could be caused by digitalis issues or vagal tone or cocaine or something like that, but unless you're getting a whole run of them, it doesn't mean anything to you. You are not going to do anything about it. This is where we start to see things that we should do. You might have a patient that's got what's called a junctional escape rhythm, okay? The SA node and the atrias are no longer firing, okay? You have a patient who's got a heart rate between 40 and 60. It's a regular heart rate, and you still have a typically normal looking QRS complex because it's still going down the normal pathways. You're just not getting anything from the top two, okay? You're only getting from the AV node. The AV node has taken over the show and it's just chilling, okay? It's an escape rhythm because it's escape from death. Think of it that way. Again, you may or may not treat this. If you have a patient who's chilling with an escape rhythm of 60 and their blood pressure is 120/80, you'll leave them alone. If you have a patient whose intrinsic rate, that escape rhythm is 60 and their blood pressure is 40/20, you're going to go do some things, okay? You could be doing atropine, you could be doing transcutaneous pacing. It could be due to a catecholamine administration, right? You maybe gave them too much Benadryl. You might have, or they might have overdosed on some sort of medication that does that, like a pesticide overdose. It could be that the SA node has failed. Maybe you had a patient who had an atrial MI, or maybe they had a right coronary artery blockage and the SA node is no longer getting any sort of blood supply, right? Or the AV node could be damaged and is just doing what it can. Same concept. The SA node and the atrias aren't doing anything. You have an escape rhythm, but it's accelerated, all right? This is, it's going a step above its normal intrinsic rate. So it might look like a sinus rhythm, but there's no P waves, okay? Usually, again, this is really well tolerated because you're in a normal heart rate. You're not necessarily going to have that atrial kick because the atrias aren't doing anything, but your heart can still pump enough volume around that your patient would never even know that they're in potentially in an accelerated junctional rhythm. Again, the same things that could cause a escape rhythm can cause an accelerated junctional rhythm. One thing that's not in here could be a junctional tachycardia. Again, same exact concept, but now instead of from 60 to 100, it's over 100. That makes sense? Again, you're just looking for P waves. All right. Now, we've moved on to the ventricles. You could have what's called a ventricular escape rhythm. Now, everything above the ventricles has failed. Your SA node has failed, your atrias have failed, your AV node has failed. So the ventricles are like, well, we're the last ones here. I guess we'll do some work, okay? The intrinsic rate in the ventricles is between 20 and 40. So you will have a patient who's got these wide, bizarre-looking QRSs, no P waves, and a rate between 20 and 40. It's usually relatively regular, but if you have more than one ventricular cell participating, then it might be a little irregular. Again, your QRS is going to be funky looking. Okay, they're going to be really wide. This is usually like, this could also potentially be called an agonal rhythm. Okay, if there's no like blood pressure or very low blood pressure associated with it. This is either seen right before it can be seen right before cardiac arrest or right after defibrillation, okay? Because it's like the heart's kind of trying to restart itself. Not usually well tolerated, right? So you're going to have a patient who's going to show signs and symptoms of shock, which results in hypotension, altered mental status, right? Cool, pale, diaphoretic, all of those things. Obviously, you're going to want to give this patient oxygen. You might want to pace them. You might want to try dopamine. But again, if the heart's really struggling, the dopamine might not work. So you really might want to move to transcutaneous pacing. Pacing also has a possibility of not working, not getting mechanical capture if there's not enough electrolytes. If it's an electrolyte imbalance causing something like this, pacing is not necessarily going to work all the time. Just keep that in mind. Now, PVCs. We talked about PACs, PJCs, PVCs, same exact thing. You're going to have this funky looking bizarre squiggle in the middle of your otherwise beautiful tracing, okay? Most commonly caused by hypoxia. As long as you only have one or two here and there, not a big deal. When you have more than three or more PVCs in a row, that's considered a run of VTAC, okay? Most of the time, not a problem. But a lot of the times it could be just a lot of different things going on. It could be acid base, electrolytes, it could be an MI, it could be hypoxia, could be the heart starting to fail. Again, you're going to treat your patient and not the monitor. So if you see a PVC every once in a while and the patient's chilling there with a good blood pressure and no chest pain complaints, Okay, that's cute. You're going to mark it down. The thing that you need to make sure that when you're marking these things down, that you need to make sure that you also indicate the underlying rhythm. You can't just say PVCs. That's not a thing. The patient is in right here is a sinus rhythm with occasional PVCs. If you had like 3 or 4 PVCs in the 6-second strip, it would be sinus rhythm with frequent PVCs. Okay, it's just, you know, making sure that you phrase everything appropriately. You could have a patient in sinus rhythm and they have 4 PVCs in a row of sinus rhythm with a run of VTAC. Okay, it's just making sure your verbiage is correct. Some other things that you might see with PVCs. Actually, here we go. So here, so you see in the middle, you're going to also label your PVCs as multifocal or unifocal. So if you see here, you have this funky looking PVC, and then you have this funky looking PVC. It's because it's coming from 2 different irritable spots in the ventricles. Okay, so you just would say it's sinus rhythm with multifocal PVCs. If you have right here would be a run of VTAC, so sinus rhythm with a run of VTAC. Or you could say right here, if you're just looking at from here over, sinus rhythm with couplet unifocal PVCs. If you have a normal rhythm followed by a PVC, that's called bigeminy. Sometimes bigeminy is a completely normal occurrence. I had an individual who had been stabbed in the heart prior. He recovered fully, but he was always in bigeminy. It was just normal for him. So you'd have a normal complex followed by a PVC. Same thing here in trigeminy. You'd have 2 normal complexes and then followed by a PVC. Bi 1 2, tri 1 2 3, right? So it's regularly irregular rhythm, right? Again, sometimes it's a normal rhythm, sometimes it's significant. You need to look at your entire patient. You can't just say, oh, this is the rhythm they're in. But you do need to know how to classify what it's called. VTAC. All right. VTAC, traditionally, you kind of see it hitting at about 120 beats a minute. It will have this like kind of ghost look, right? Or this like Pac-Man ghost, right? You can identify VTAC in your EKG by all of the in the precordial leads, all of your tachycardia bits, like it's going to all your QRSs are going to go in the same direction. So this pointy part is considered your QRS in VTAC. You have 2 different types of VTAC. The monomorphic, which is obviously every single one looks exactly the same, or polymorphic, also known as torsade de poids, okay, or turning of the points. You'll still have that very kind of uniform looking up and down, but it will get really big and then really small and big and then small because it's changing which is the primary focal point of creating the tachycardia. Okay, VTAC can potentially be tolerated for a period of time. Again, this is going to depend on the patient's overall well-being. Okay, I had a woman who was in torsades once. She walked herself to the ambulance. We pulled up, she walked straight out, and she was in torsades. And she was like, I'm just having some chest pressure. And I was like, sit down, sit down, sit down. Right? I had a lady who was in VTAC. She was in VTAC for the length of my arms. We printed it out, and it was 5 feet worth of VTAC. And she was just sitting there chilling, chit-chatting with us, okay? But then you can have other patients who go into VTAC and become unresponsive, like right away. So it really depends on the patient's ability to compensate. So again, it could be caused by a number of different things. Most of the time, ischemia is a good possibility. Electrolyte imbalances, drug issues. You if the patient is awake, you want to ask them about things that they might be taking, medications they might be taking. Whatever you're doing for managing this patient is going to depend on their level of consciousness, right? So there is a entire protocol for VTAC with a pulse. VTAC with a pulse is generally the patients who are awake and talking to you, because you might not be able to actually palpate a pulse, okay? But if they're awake and chit-chatting with you and they're VTAC on the monitor, it's good to assume that they have a pulse. Those are your patients who you're going to do an amiodarone drip on, right? We do not slam amiodarone undiluted into a live patient. It hurts, okay? They are not going to like you. Synchronized cardioversion is if a patient's awake and talking to you, but their blood pressure is really low. If their blood pressure is non-existent, they become a defibrillation, right? Magnesium is the medication of choice for torsade de poids, okay? And again, you're going to call medical control for that one, and they're going to give you 2 grams of mag in 10 cc's because you're diluting it, but not as much as you would for like preeclampsia or something, or asthma. So keep that in mind. This is probably the one that you're going to see and that you're going to get excited about because you actually get to do some cool stuff. So now, like, let's look real quick. Torsade de poids, right? Very distinctive kind of crescendo, decrescendo, as opposed to VFib, which is just whatever that is, right? It's just squiggles. It could be a variety of size. It's not necessarily going to be easy to see. Sometimes when it gets really fine, it could look similar to asystole, but there's nothing going on that's coordinated. You are 110%. You're defibrillating this patient. This patient is dead. Okay? It will result in extra dead if you don't do something. Okay? It's very chaotic. Something has gone on with this patient. It could be that they've gone into respiratory arrest and that's brought on to cardiac arrest. They could be acidic. They could be going RNT phenomenon, right? Those patients who end up getting hit in the chest and just the wrong time can go into VFib, electrical injuries, all sorts of different things can cause VFib. But there's only one thing that we do to treat it, and that's rapid defibrillation and CPR. Okay, remember that's pacemakers. There are a number of different pacemakers out there. Some of them are dual chamber, which means that they're going to give you an atrial pace and a ventricular pace. And some are just ventricular pacemakers. So if you look at the one on the left, you have this vertical spike. That's the electric of the pacemaker. Okay, so it's just instigating the heart to fire. And they've done, if it's an atrial pacemaker only, and it's only stimulating the heart above the ventricles. So it's going to follow the normal pathway. So you're going to have a normal looking QRS. You might even have a P wave. As opposed
to about the vertical spike before the P wave.
Yes. Yeah. And then on the other one, you have a vertical spike before the QRS. That's a ventricular pacemaker. So it's the ventricles are not being stimulated enough. So they just put the spike, they put the stimulation area right before the ventricles. Okay. There's some pacemakers that are all the time. There are some that are on demand. So like the one on the right, you would say, oh, that looks like an on-demand pacemaker because you have a P wave in ventricular standstill, right? Nothing came after it. So this pacemaker is like, oh, well, you tried, but you didn't do anything. So I'll pick up the beat. Okay. So they're getting really smart and they're also getting a lot smaller. So there's a number of different ways that they can install the pacemaker. You may, like, they're getting more advanced now, so you might not even see the spike might be really hard to see, but it helps kind of improve the patient's heart rate. You are not necessarily going to be doing anything for this. You just need to recognize it. But if the patient has what's called like a runaway pacemaker, where their heart rate's really fast because the pacemaker's just going, you can put a magnet over it. I don't know if we carry magnets strong enough to reset the pacemaker. Or you can have a pacemaker that's just, it's firing, but the patient's got such a significant electrolyte imbalance that it's not capturing. Okay. So there's a number of different things that can go wrong with a pacemaker. The battery could run out, and you won't see spikes at all. So asking the patient when the last time their pacemaker was interrogated could be very useful. So we also have those things that we can't shock. Back in BLS land, this is just when the AED tells you that, hey, don't deliver a shock. Asystole. It looks like a flat line. The patient's not breathing. The patient's not have a pulse. Asystole. Boom. CPR, epi. This patient's usually not coming back. Very poor outcomes on patients who have gone into asystole. There is zero electrical activity. What you're going to do for all of your cardiac arrest patients is you're going to start thinking about what's called your H's and T's, and which are your potential causes of cardiac arrest. And those are listed here. You have hypovolemia, hypoxia, hydrogen ions, which is acidosis, hypothermia, hyperkalemia, hypoglycemia, which is why we always check a blood sugar in patients in cardiac arrest. Could be toxins from a drug overdose, a tamponade, right? There's fluid in that pericardial sac that's preventing the patient from their heart from beating. Tension pneumo, any sort of thrombosis activity, right? Could be a severe stroke, a pulmonary embolism, an MI, or trauma, okay? Those are the things that should be kind of running through your head whenever you're working an arrest or a peri-arrest, right? You got there, the patient's still just barely alive. These are the things that you could potentially correct to prevent them from going into cardiac arrest. Review those. Like, there's a lot of things that we can do to fix it. And it's also a lot of things that we do during cardiac arrest, like when we administer bicarbonate, sodium bicarbonate, that's to try to help reduce hydrogen ions. We administer calcium, that's to help overcome hyperkalemia. We check a blood sugar and administer dextrose if necessary for hypoglycemia. Hypoxia, we ventilate the patient, right? We do a lot of those things already during our algorithmic, whatchamacallit, PEA, or pulseless electrical activity, is a state of being, not a rhythm. Okay? PEA needs to have a rhythm associated with it. So it could be the patient's in sinus rhythm and PEA. Okay? They still have some sort of electrical activity going on, but they are dead with no pulse.
I had that yesterday.
Okay, good. So again, you're going to evaluate your H's and T's. It is not a rhythm, though. You have to, and you will get nailed to the wall in class if you just say, oh, patient's in PEA. It's PEA, or it's sinus rhythm with PEA, or PEA with a rhythm of sinus, sinus rhythm. You have to tie those two together. If patient's hyperkalemic, you would potentially assume that they're hyperkalemic based on their medical history. So if you have a patient who is a poorly controlled diabetic who might be in DKA, they would be hyperkalemic. If you have a patient who is on dialysis and they've maybe missed dialysis, you can safely assume that the possibility of hyperkalemia. If they're in pulseless electrical activity, you might see, and hyperkalemia, you might see T wave changes, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Great question. But we all understand what PEA, like, you have to tie it along with whatever other rhythm that you see. Okay? You can't just say they're in PEA. I will come out from wherever it is I am and smack you. All right, we are going to discuss blocks in our next lecture. Just hold on. Yeah, we're going to do blocks in the next lecture. Everything after this is the next lecture. Do you guys have any questions, comments, or concerns about what we did today?
I had a question about, so the textbook doesn't really go that in depth on cardiology, and we have the other books to go up to follow up on. How can we best study those other books with what we learned today also?
I think what you need to do right now is you need to just look at a lot of rhythms. Okay, so if you have one of those books that is just a lot of EKG rhythms, just go through it and like identify it and then check yourself. So, all right, so like, okay, I think this one is a sinus rhythm. Go back and check. Yes, it's a sinus rhythm. All right, I think this one is this. No, it's not. Go back and reassess it. That's going to be the most valuable thing for you right now is just repetition. There is a website that lets you play with EKG rhythms. I'll send it out once I find it. I think it's like Stat EKG or something like that. It will put rhythms up on the monitor on a monitor for you and let you play a game. I think practicing identifying the rhythms is going to be the number one thing that you need to do. The rhythms that you have to have down: VTach, VFib, asystole, and your heart blocks. We didn't do heart blocks yet, but those are the ones that you're going to have down. Okay.
Okay.
Because those are the ones that are like your criticals on your tests. So if you just practice, honestly, just practice. It's like learning a foreign language. Okay. The more you look at it, the more you practice with it, the more comfortable you're going to be, and the more you're going to be like, oh, okay, that's normal. I'm not confused by that.
I failed Spanish multiple times. That doesn't help me.
Try Russian. It's just like you're learning a new alphabet. It's essentially what you're doing is you're learning a new alphabet. And then we'll start kind of piecing together like what it means, what each part means, like, or when things start looking not normal. I would also say look at your protocols. Look at all your cardiac protocols, okay? And just kind of start tying together what medications go with what heart rhythms. And by heart rhythms, I mean fast, slow, okay? So your medications for your fast rhythms are these. Your medications for your slow rhythms are these. If that, I think, will help you start piecing everything together.
Okay.
Okay.
Cool.
You're welcome. All right, guys. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Go ahead.
I mean, it's on topic, but it's a little different. Like, so say if you were to take a heart, like, and it's the heart outside of the body, and like this is like more like an experimental type thing. Like the heart is outside the body. If you were to put an electric charge onto the heart, will it go through like the SA node, boom, AV node, boom, and then it'll go all the way down the particular? Like, will it like follow that even outside the body, or is it like?
I mean, I don't know about outside the body. Like if it was like still a live heart, I'm going to say yes, but it also depends
Yeah,
where yeah.
Heart, but it's just like, yeah, right. That's yeah, because that's like a defibrillator. So yeah, it's okay.
Yeah.
Never mind.
So basically,
Never mind. Yeah, I was
no,
just
actually,
like,
it's a good question because it's going to bring us into bundle branch blocks a little bit when we get to that lecture. So it depends on where you apply the stimulus. And this is like the same thing where you see like a ventricular pacemaker. So if you are using a ventricular pacemaker, it's not going down that normal path. It's going cell to cell to cell to cell. It's like the wave, okay? Whereas if you put it down the normal pathway, you get those nice, neat, tight, narrow complexes because it's going down like the express path, right? So like if you were to jump on the LIE and there's no traffic and you're going down the main roadway, imagine that is your electrical system. Okay. Nice and fast. Now, if you get onto the service road, you have to stop at every light. That's when it's doing that aberrant conduction and that's going from cell to cell to cell and it's causing a slower progression of the electric. So that's why you'll get those wide, bizarre EKGs when it's not going down the normal pathway.
okay.
Okay. And we'll go over that again when we do bundle branch blocks. But that's kind of like the basis of that is that you're either going fast or you're taking the service road in the heart.
Okay.
So depending on where that stimulus, that electrical stimulus, that external stimulus is applied is going to be whether it's going down that normal pathway or not.
Okay. All right.
Yes, I will be sending the review sheet once I log off. guys. And if there's no other questions, I hope you all have a lovely day. I know it's a lot of information, so I'm gonna let you all digest all
Thank
that.
you. Do as well.
Yeah, thank you, Nicole.
You're welcome, guys. Have a great day.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Nicole.
Bye.
Thanks, Nicole.